Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. If the SNP win elections in Scotland this coming May, they've promised another referendum on independence. Opinion polls show the Nationalists have received a boost as a result of Brexit and would be very likely to win what's dubbed Indy Ref 2. The Union then would seem to be on its last legs. Is that really so? Would Westminster even allow another vote? And is there a way to keep all four nations stuck together? Today, we have three speakers to look at that question. They are Murdo Fraser, a Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament for Mid-Scotland and Fife. Hello, Murdo.
Hello, Nicholas.
Whereabouts are you at the moment, Murdo?
So I'm at home in Perth, which is in the centre of Scotland and at the heart of the region that I represent.
Fantastic. No, well, we also have Jeremy Jennings, Professor of Political Theory at King's College London. Hello, Jeremy.
Hello.
And we also have David Torrance, an expert in British constitutional affairs and an author of numerous books, including biographies of both Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. The aim here is to see where the Union is heading post-Brexit. And to start with, David, can you just outline for us the growing support for the SNP in Scotland? It's not just down to Brexit, is it?
No, it's often presented in those terms, but I think there are sort of three main stages in where we're now at. For a long time before the first what we might call the first independence referendum in 2014, support for independence in Scotland was pretty stable in the early 30s. Around at most a third of Scots said they supported an independent Scotland. During the long referendum campaign, and it was very long, from the beginning of 2012 until September 2014, that support rose to where it ended up on the day at 45%. So quite a significant increase. And that was a lot of traditionally Labour voters who switched to supporting at first independence and the SNP. Things then stabilized again at around 45–46%. Brexit comes along in June 2016. And initially there's a little spurt of support, increase in support for independence. It then falls back to where it was. Lots of things going on there, including the interesting fact that a lot of people who'd voted for independence in Scotland also supported Brexit, so there were some divided loyalties for a while. And then as Brexit unfolds, as most people will know, it took a very long time. It was a very complicated process, lots of political and constitutional crosswinds and fluctuations. Support then increased to about 50% for Scottish independence, and that in itself was significant, given that referendums in the UK have come to be decided by a simple majority. And then the third stage, I would say, is the pandemic. From March last year until present, you have a phenomenon whereby Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party and the First Minister of Scotland, in charge of public health as a devolved matter, a policy decided on by the devolved Scottish Parliament. She's very visible, as are her counterparts in Wales and Northern Ireland. She is seen in presentational terms, if not in factual terms, to have handled the pandemic, communicated with the people of Scotland much more clearly and consistently than the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and support for independence increases again. And we've now had a run of, I think, between 15 and 20 opinion polls, all showing support for independence to be between 54 and 58%. So a clear majority. It was said 20 years ago, when there was a long campaign for a devolved Scottish Parliament, that devolution was the settled will of the Scottish people. Just a couple of weeks ago, Nicola Sturgeon said that she believed independence was the settling will of the Scottish people.
Wow, okay, well, thank you very much for that many-layered explanation there. Murdo, I'm going to turn to you now. You are, and I think some people abroad might not know that the Conservative Party is not just the Conservative Party, it's the Conservative and Unionist Party. So that's the ground on which the Conservatives stand. The interesting thing is that you voted Remain in the referendum, I think. So from that point of view, I'd just like to get at your perspective on what damage Brexit has done the Unionist cause in Scotland.
I think I would largely agree with David's analysis in that I think Brexit has been a factor in rise and support both for the SNP and for independence, but not the only factor. Interesting enough, the latest opinion poll came out last night. A Survation poll put independence on 51% and support for the union on 49%, which actually is a bit of a drop-off from where Survation was back in November, which was 54 to 46. So whether that means anything much or not, I don't know. But you know, there's not a large majority for independence, but the polls would suggest, you know, a small majority, and certainly, you know, that's changed since probably this time last year. I think, and I would agree here with David, I think the relative popularity of the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Scotland compared to Nicola Sturgeon is probably more of a factor than Brexit. The latest figures I saw were that Nicola Sturgeon was on a plus 50% favourability and Boris Johnson was on a minus 50% favourability in Scotland. Now, that's a pretty large gap for any political party to have to try and deal with. I think that's been an issue. But certainly from a nationalist perspective, they've been very keen to exploit Brexit as a political opportunity for them. And essentially, the slogan that they will run with, which encapsulate their message, is Scotland voted to stay in the EU and Scots are being dragged out of the EU against our will because England voted for Brexit, as indeed, of course, did Wales. So poor old Scotland, you know, this historic pro-European outward-looking nation is being dragged out of Europe by these horrible little Englanders in Westminster with their top hats and their antiquated, backward-looking imperial legacies. And that's the way they like to portray themselves. Scotland's this modern, dynamic nation tied in with this backward-looking in post-imperial England. Now, of course, that's mostly nonsense, as we know. They conveniently forget that 1 million Scots voted Leave in the 2016 referendum, as against 1.6 million who voted Remain, including lots of people like me, who are unionists, who voted Remain because actually we felt that we have no problem with being part of larger units. In fact, there's a lot of logic to saying if you're comfortable with Scotland being in the UK, you're also comfortable with the UK being in a larger union that is the EU. But they've tried to exploit this, and they've done that actually quite effectively. And I think the UK government's got a lot of work to do, and perhaps, you know, we'll come on to this, has got a lot of work to do to try and demonstrate to people in Scotland, firstly, that Brexit will not be the disaster for Scotland and the UK that the nationalists want it to be and want to portray it as. And secondly, that UK structures and institutions are capable of reform to take account of the fact we are no longer in the EU, and that will mean changes to the UK constitution, because the current devolution settlement was established on the basis that we would be in the EU, and it was never envisaged that we would leave. And that means that the balance of powers between the government in Edinburgh and the government in London will probably need to be adjusted to take account of the fact we're not in the EU anymore.
Okay, Murdo, I'd love to come back to you and David on that section, you know, in a moment, to what should be the response. Can you change the constitution of the EU? Can you create a different settlement which will satisfy all four nations and perhaps help hold things together? But before we do that, Jeremy Jennings, let's just turn to you now. I'm very interested by the idea of you know, what is the glue that's keeping the UK together? And how much that has shifted, and how you think that has changed, and what are the sort of key proponents in that? I mean, I think in my mind, You've got Brexit has been something that is looming, and that has evolved over the last 20 years or so. And against that, you've got devolution. And I see these as two competing forces. But I don't know what is your take on what is keeping the union together?
Well, I suspect a lot of sentimentality, actually. This has been around for a long, long time, 300 years or more in the case of Scotland. And it's a pretty adventurous thing to do, to go for broke and go away and be independent and so on. So I suspect that a lot of it is historic sentiment. I mean, one thing that tends to be forgotten is, never mind the Scots who voted to remain, there's a number of Scots who live in England. One of the things that I'm very conscious of with many Scots friends I have in journalism and so on is how deeply aggrieved they feel about all of this, that they were denied a vote in the referendum and so on. And this is, I mean, I'm very, very English, but I have family in Scotland, and many of us do. And this is this sort of this notion that we're separate nations, I think is very alien to quite a few of us. I think that sense of a sort of a common history, a common belonging, has been very, very important, and all the other sort of institutions. Let us remember that the Scots, if any of the four nations built the British Empire, it was the Scots through the immense contribution they made to the British Army and so on. So there's an immense sort of historic connection between the four parts of the United Kingdom. There's immense economic benefit as well. The Scottish economy, it's one of its great, well, the Scottish economy, the Scottish intellectual world has one of its great moments in the 18th century after union with England and so on. So I think there's, historically been lots and lots of things which have brought the four nations together. We're obviously talking explicitly about Scotland, but obviously there's been a major change. I mean, one thing to remind ourselves of, and Murdo will be very familiar with this, is that until relatively recently, the majority of parliamentary members at Westminster were Conservative. And there's been this massive change over the last few years, and the collapse of the Labour Party as well is another factor in all of this. So we've suddenly found ourselves in this very sort of almost unexpected position. And going back to the point about the settled opinion of the Scots, we remember that devolution was promised to us as, in a sense, the final settlement of this. This was going to put an end to the nationalist drive, and it simply has not done so. It is rather peculiar what's happened, and I mean, it's up to the Scots to decide themselves what they wish to do, but it does rather it seems very, very odd after all these years of rhetoric. I mean, for crying out loud, I mean, Britain was largely governed by Scots until recently. Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, even David Cameron, and all these sort of people. I mean, the Scots were all over the place. Yet suddenly this seems to be forgotten. So it's very, very strange what's happened. So the glue undoubtedly seems to have slackened its hold on the whole thing, but it's putting the glue back together, gluing it back together would be jolly difficult.
We don't have anyone from the SNP here to sort of bounce back at this, and the focus of this discussion on unionism and what's the threat to it, if you like. David, it would seem the response, at least from conservative circles in Westminster, is why should there be another referendum? So that's my first point, is what's the debate about that? Is that a possible, can you actually carry on saying, look, it would appear from opinion polls, it would appear from a parliamentary vote that a large majority of Scots are in favour of a second referendum. Can you keep on sort of denying that and just pushing it away? So that's my first question. And then the second one is, what kind of, if you're going to say, look, we need to come up with an alternative, and I'll come back to Murdo on this in a second, what kind of alternatives are being discussed? So two questions there for you.
So the UK government line hasn't really moved on from when Theresa May was Prime Minister, actually, because so actually to roll back a bit, there was a Scottish Parliament election in 2016. The SNP manifesto included a line that said if there is a material change in circumstances, by which they meant political, constitutional circumstances, we would push for a second referendum on Scottish independence, bearing in mind that in 2014 it had been spoken of as a once in a generation opportunity. So in 2017, as it became clear that the UK was leaving the European Union, Nicola Sturgeon made a formal request for a second independence referendum, and I can go into the mechanism of that later on if anyone's interested. Theresa May's response was, now is not the time. And now I think, as it happened, that captured pretty well where a majority of Scots were at that point. Very, very good political communications. But of course, it was not a definite no. It implied that at some point in the future, there would be a suitable time to have a referendum. So there was always a strategic weakness in there, I think, for the Conservative Party in the UK government. It then sort of went away. There was a general election. The SNP lost support. I think a lot of people felt that the steam had gone out of the issue, but of course, that wasn't true. And the UK government position now is pretty much the same. They don't use those words, and they don't rule it out completely, but they say, look, it was talked of as a once in a generation opportunity in 2014. A generation has not elapsed since then. We can get into a debate about what exactly constitutes a generation. I would say 20 years, perhaps 15. Boris Johnson has suggested 30, 35 years. Some people even say longer than that. And they say rather less convincingly, I think, given the opinion polls, that the matter was settled in 2014. But of course, as I said earlier,
David, you're getting into very troubled waters there. I mean, one thinks of the Catalans and that being forbidden from holding a referendum, and you can't just say no, no, no. At some point, it's going to be seen as being undemocratic, surely. Yeah,
I mean, I can't comment on the politics of that, but it would seem quite clear that, and many commentators, I'll escape to commentators, many commentators have suggested that simply saying no, no, no over and over again is not a sustainable position politically. And they have also suggested that simply saying no, especially if the SNP get another majority in the Scottish Parliament election due in a few months, that will simply increase support for independence. And there's a historical analogy here. In the 80s and 90s, there was a campaign for a devolved Scottish Parliament, and there was a Conservative government at Westminster, often quite unpopular, that said, no, you can't have a devolved Scottish Parliament. All that served to do at the time was consolidate Scottish public opinion increasingly behind that option.
Okay. Let's come back to you in a moment, David, about the sort of possible constitutional responses and the idea of changing the UK. But Murdo, just to pick up on what David was saying, you can't keep saying no forever, can you?
Well, I think the strategic approach from the UK government, and I'm not in the UK government, right? So I can talk about this from a distance. Is pretty much based on a pretty cold assumption that if there were to be a referendum now or in the next year or two, it would be very difficult to win it, and that's for the factors we discussed. The reality is, Boris Johnson is very unpopular in Scotland. Brexit's had an impact. Even though the economic and financial case for independence is incredibly weak and much weaker now than it was in 2014, the emotional pull of independence, I think, is stronger. And this is personified in Nicola Sturgeon. And the really interesting thing is, if you drill down the opinion poll figures on independence, there's now much more support for independence amongst women than amongst men, which is a big change from where we were back in 2014. And that is put down to the fact that it is women looking at the leadership of Nicola Sturgeon over the pandemic and being impressed. Now, what's interesting, of course, about that is, generally speaking, political scientists would take the view that women as a whole tend to be more risk averse than men when it comes to taking decisions. And therefore, if we got into an independence referendum where the debate became around economics and finance and how an independent Scotland would pay the bills, that might well go back in the other direction. But right where we are now, the UK government probably thinks, we don't want to have another referendum because we might lose. And the last thing Boris Johnson wants on his gravestone is that he is the Lord North of the 21st century, the Prime Minister who lost America, and he'll be the Prime Minister who lost Scotland. So he's not going to have a referendum if he thinks he's going to lose it. And there's just enough political cover, I think, in saying the last referendum was only 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago. That's not a generation. That'll get you through the next 4 or 5 years, I think.
I want to come to Jeremy next, but as I do so, please can everyone start putting their questions down in the Q&A box. Just click on the Q&A box on the bottom left-hand side and start typing away your questions, and then we'll come to you, and then you can put your questions direct to the panelists. Jeremy, I know you're thinking of something to say, but I also want to talk about the English response to this. I mean, in terms of Brexit, the large majority of voters in England voted for Brexit. And I would also say, I point to an opinion poll in 2018 that showed that most Conservative voters really wouldn't care too much if Scotland left the Union, or Northern Ireland for that matter.
Well, just one thing, I do want to say one thing. I think you said, can we deny this forever and ever? Manifestly not. But you can deny it for a few years. It is only 6 years ago. And you've got I voted Remain, but I accepted the result. I think you have to do that. Otherwise, you get the never-ending thing. You just simply say, keep going. Well, until I get the result I want, we'll just have more of these votes. I don't think you can do that. I think it's politically immoral actually to do that. So I think it's only 6 years ago. I think Boris can certainly hold out for a lot longer on good grounds. It's very interesting about that. Going to talk about the unpopularity of Boris Johnson in Scotland, I actually read recently that Nicola Sturgeon was more popular in England than Boris Johnson. I don't know whether that's true, but it sort of tells you something about Boris's particular effect that he has. I can't say I know him well, and he is personally charming, but by God, he drives me crazy when I listen to him. So I could only imagine in Scotland he must go down like a rat sandwich. It's very difficult, and I think that. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of. See, I just want to say one thing. I remember thinking about the EU, and one thing I'm pleased that Britain has lost. The UK has left the EU because we can't blame the EU anymore. That's all that sort of it's the EU's fault. One thing, if Scots leave, fine. They can't blame England anymore. There's an element of honesty about that, which I find rather attractive, which I think lots of people in England find attractive. If that's what they want, let them have it. Fine, we'll regret it. It's very, very sad because, as I say, all of us have family. Many of us have family either sides of the border and so on.
But Jeremy, aren't you really saying that you miserable Scots, screw you if you want to go your own way?
I'm not saying that. As I say, I've got family there. I've got family in Aberdeen. I've got family in Ayrshire. I've got family down in Dumfries. I love them dearly. But there's an element of in the same way with the UK over Brexit. Okay. Fine, guys, you're moaning and moaning away. Now, okay, live with it. This is a decision you've taken. Now live with it. If the Scots want that, well, let them live with it. That's fine. It's fine. Put an end to grievance politics and get on with it. I would regret it bitterly. Yeah, bitterly. But I do think there's if that's what people want, then they have a right to have it.
Yeah, and I would think
make the best of it.
A growing trend among English voters. And I think for me, that's very interesting because in terms of that seems to be the driving force rather than this sense of British identity. I would identify myself as being British foremost. And, I've got relatives up, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and here I am on the Welsh border and, with Welsh ancestry too.
Precisely.
But I see myself primarily as British, but I think less and less people do.
I personally find it offensive when you have to fill in those forms and have to identify myself as English. I don't see myself that way, but increasingly we're invited to do so.
Okay, let's David, can you sum up, and then we've got questions coming in now from people. But and this is complex, but if you can try and do it briefly. What are the possibilities or responses to this drive for independence, this drive to breaking up the union, what are the possible, is there a different kind of constitutional settlement, federation? Are there different ways of dividing up the powers at the moment? Can you discuss those ideas?
Yeah, generally speaking, and this has been much discussed by former prime ministers, cabinet ministers, academics, journalists, backbench MPs. Everyone is sort of suggesting schemes on how to save the union. Some say you should have more devolution, give Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland more autonomy. Some have suggested there's not really much more to give in that respect. Others have spoken about a formal federation. Political scientists would say the UK is already quasi-federal in nature, although England lacks its own parliament. Some talk about splitting England up into different units and having the House of Lords as a Senate of the nations and regions. Gordon Brown has spoken about that. Sir John Major, a former Prime Minister, has suggested having 2 referendums, so one on the general principle of independence, so actually conceding a referendum, but then pre-negotiating what independence would look like and putting that to another referendum. The hope from some people, of course, being that Scots will then reject it. Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, the leader of the opposition, has spoken of a sort of nationwide constitutional convention led, I think, by Gordon Brown, to talk about spreading power not only more evenly and tidily to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also within England. And so there's a myriad of ideas, whether or not any of them are actually...
I would say perhaps the horse has bolted. That the English are not interested in devolution, and they're certainly not in favour of giving other parts of the union more powers. Is that right?
Historically, actually, English public opinion has been quite relaxed about more autonomy for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. That's decreased over time. And although English public opinion generally favours more autonomy within England, there is no clear consensus about what form that takes, which is partly why, in terms of responding to that, successive governments have really struggled.
Okay, fantastic. Simon Jackson's got our first question. Go ahead, Simon.
Hello. Support for independence is supposedly strong amongst the young. Is this something that is likely to go away as is this youthful exuberance which goes away as middle-aged heads supplant young hearts, or is it part of an inexorable demographic drift?
Oh, Murdo, I got to ask you. You got to ask that one. Answer that one.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I'll start by answering with an anecdote, because the first period of SNP surgeon support was back in the mid-70s. And this was the period when Scotland had just discovered North Sea oil, and the SNP had quite a big boost. David will remind me, I think the 74 general election, they went up to, was it 13 seats or something? 11 seats from nothing. And I was at primary school in Inverness at the time, and every single kid in my primary school in Inverness, myself included, wore SNP badges on our blazers saying it's Scotland's oil, right? So you're looking at someone who was a pre-adolescent nationalist who grew out of it. And I think, we don't really know whether the current crop of younger people attracted to independence, which undoubtedly there are, will maintain their views. I certainly think there is a clear difference in view if the major downside of the independence argument now is around economics, finance, what currency we would use. That's a much, much easier sell to a 21-year-old with no house, mortgage, savings, pension, investments, and family, as opposed to that same person who's 30 years older with all of those things and that stake in society.
Can I just add something on that? That's a nice story, Murdo, although I think
And it is true, David.
I don't doubt it. The trouble is for unionists, I think now, is that the opinion polling, and we have very detailed opinion polling, shows it's not just a majority amongst young, very young people, but on certain breakdowns, there's a clear majority for independence amongst, I think, everyone under 50. And so this stretches into middle age as well. It's not just young people. And in that sense, even if there was some movement or drop off, it would have to take place across several generations to tip the scales back towards a clear majority in favor of the union.
Okay. Nigel Harley's got a next question. Nigel Harley, go ahead, Nigel.
Thanks. The undoubted success of Ireland's membership of the EU, I would have thought, has some impact on SNP thinking. And if we look at this from an economic point of view, it's really actually fairly dramatic. I mean, for a long, long time, the Republic was considered the poor relation of Ireland. Nowadays, the situation is completely reversed. The Southern Irish, when compared with Northern Irish, are in a much better economic situation. Without question, the arrangements, the negotiation over the Irish border has given a shove towards a united Ireland, which again, I would have thought must have some impact on the thinking in Edinburgh.
Who's...
Can I say something about that? I think that's really important. I think that this historical parallel is really very important, actually, because if you look at the way that the debates in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, were framed, it's very, very much the membership of the European Union was a way of escaping English dominance. And that's clearly a rhetoric which, even if I were in favour of Scottish independence, I'd be using. This is a way to really free yourself from historic dominance by a foreign power. The Irish use that very, very effectively. And secondly, I think the point is made. The point to be made is very, very clear that actually for Ireland, being in the European Union has been a great success. The Irish have poured enormous amounts of money into education and so on, a highly educated workforce, and so on. And I'm sure, say, if I were an advocate of Scottish independence, this would be precisely the sort of argument that I would be using. Look at Ireland. And I also think that the protocol with regard to Northern Ireland is actually a disgrace, and it will push the forces of Irish nationalism ever forward.
Yeah, I must say that I think of Enoch Powell, or my stepfather was a conservative politician and a Eurosceptic, and I think both of them would have been horrified at the Brexit settlement that left Northern Ireland outside of the Union, and amazed that any politician, any unionist politician worth their salt would agree to it. But that's the political reality, I guess. And Andy Mendes has got a good question. Go ahead, Andy.
Hi. First of all, Jeremy, Sue Mendes says hello.
Oh, that's very kind.
Because she doesn't get paid for it. But I read John Kampfner's book after one of the seminars we had earlier on in the year, which I thought it was very good. And he asserted that if Germany was in a situation that Britain got itself into over Brexit, rather than just going politically nuts and having the sort of referendum campaign which gave us the disaster that we've got, the Germans would have set up a proper commission, would have done serious research and produced a considered view on the pros and cons of Brexit in that case. And I just wondered if that was a way forward or backwards for Scottish independence, if there is this standoff on a political standoff about a referendum. Why don't we do something sensible and set up a commission which says, as I suspect, it would be a disaster, but at least produce these funny fact things.
Murdo, there are arguments being made along those lines. I mean, it would seem slightly hypocritical from the sort of Brexit referendum. If you can vote for Brexit in such a simplistic way, why can't you approach indie ref in the same way?
We should learn lessons, though, Nicholas. Even British politicians learn the lessons of the disasters that they've brought upon us.
Or perhaps not, I don't know. But Murdo, there are suggestions being made along those lines, though, that if you are going to have another referendum, it needs to have all the ins and outs. There needs to be some kind of settlement arranged beforehand, and then you have a vote on that.
Yeah, I mean, David mentioned earlier, the John Major idea of two referendums, which I think is simply bonkers, frankly. Because why would you vote no in the first referendum? What possible purpose would there be in that? Because everybody would think, well, we might as well just vote yes and see what the deal is. We're not binding ourselves to anything. On the broader point, I think I think that's an interesting idea. The question is, who would do it, and would any work that was done be seen to be sufficiently objective that would be credible? Because I mean, back in 2014, the SNP produced the white paper on independence, which was a very detailed piece of work and tried to answer lots of questions. Very thin, of course, on the economic case. And they then replaced that because it was all debunked, because it assumed the oil price would remain over $110 a barrel, which very quickly fell well below that. And then they replaced that with a new economic case from Andrew Wilson, who's the sort of quasi-economist who speaks for them on these figures, which has been pretty unconvincing. So the SNP themselves have struggled to put forward a comprehensive new economic case with the pros and cons. I mean, I've been chatting to folk in the Treasury that this is something the UK Treasury should be doing, looking at what independence would mean. But of course, if it's done by the Treasury, the nationalists will just say it's politically biased, and therefore it'll just enter the same old bun fight between both sides that we've been struggling with for the last decade.
Yeah, there's a problem with legitimacy there. As Murdo suggests, everyone would need to buy into the process, and in a polarized political context, we're not quite as bad as the United States yet, but it's still quite polarized. That simply wouldn't happen. But to repeat, Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, has more or less suggested this route. And his attempt to deal with the legitimacy point is to have Gordon Brown head up the exercise. Now, I'll leave it for others to decide whether that would work. But Starmer's rationale is that Gordon Brown is someone with broader currency, at least in Scotland, and perhaps beyond just unionist voters, that he could potentially have buy-in from both sides of the debate.
Okay, David, can I ask you one thing? It's slightly tangential, but where does the monarchy stand in all of this?
Pretty much the same, really. In fact, a curious feature of the first independence referendum was the very enthusiastic backing for the monarchy from Alex Salmond, who was then leader of the SNP and First Minister. Some at the time, including myself, speculated that this had more to do with reassuring small c conservative Scots who worried that an independent Scotland would mean a Republican Scotland. And broadly speaking, the SNP has remained sort of small m monarchist, although surveys of the party and its supporters show quite clearly that there's quite a strong Republican bent there. But it seems unlikely it would mean anything in the short or even the medium term, I think.
Right, okay.
An independent Scotland would simply become one of Her Majesty's 16 or then 17 realms. She is of course head of state in lots of countries.
Yeah, okay. I'm tempted to be very mean and ask you all to say how long you're going to think how long you think the union's going to last for, and how long. It's another way of saying how long can you put the referendum off. So, Murdo, answer either of those questions.
Well, I mean, how long you put the referendum, that assumes the referendum can't be won. And this is, I'm not a unionist defeatist. I do think another referendum can be won. Actually, I think perhaps a more likely scenario is what happened in Quebec post-95 after their second referendum, when people eventually just got fed up of constantly talking about the Constitution and wanted to move on. And I also wonder how much of the current surge in support for independence will survive Nicola Sturgeon, because a lot of it, I think, is tied to her personal popularity. There is frankly nobody in the SNP ranks anywhere near her standing with the public. And if she were to fall from office, then I think very quickly we would see a reversal of fortune. And I sit on the Scottish Parliamentary Committee that's currently investigating the Alex Salmond affair.
So hang on
And
1 second, because there's going to be a lot of people here who don't know anything about this. So I don't know who's allowed to say what. But David, just to start with, can you sum up what we know, what has been said, and what muck this leaves on whose faces?
Well, all I can do is describe what happened. Alex Salmond, who led the SNP on and off for 25 years and led the party and the independence campaign in 2014, he resigned as First Minister after the referendum. He became an MP again at Westminster. A couple of years ago, allegations, I wouldn't say surfaced, but official complaints were made to the police about sexual misconduct. It coincided with the Me Too movement sweeping across the Atlantic. That became a criminal investigation. It went to court. Alex Salmond was acquitted on all the charges. It was all very dramatic, and for nationalists quite traumatic and unpleasant. There are now ongoing suggestions from certain quarters that Alex Salmond was the victim of a conspiracy promoted by Nicola Sturgeon, his successor as leader of the party and First Minister, which in itself is remarkable, given that those two had a very close political and, by all accounts, personal relationship going back a couple of decades. That is all, as Murdo suggests, still playing out.
So Murdo, what have you got to assess then? You're sitting on the committee that assesses what?
so the committee was set up by the Scottish Parliament to investigate the Scottish Government's handling of the harassment complaints. So originally there were two women in the Scottish Government who made complaints against Alex Salmond, which is not the same issue as the criminal trial, but clearly there was an overlap between the two. And these complaints were mishandled. Alex Salmond took a court challenge to the Scottish Government, claiming that the complaints process that had been established was unfair, and he won that against the Scottish Government. So here you had the bizarre scenario of the former First Minister of Scotland suing the government which he had previously led and winning, and that led to a loss of £500,000 in legal fees. So the Parliamentary Committee was set up to investigate that. And there's a parallel investigation taking place by James Hamilton QC, the former Director of Public Prosecutions in Northern Ireland, who's been asked to investigate breaches of the ministerial code by Nicola Sturgeon in relation to claims that she misled Parliament about key aspects of it.
And
without going into too many details, it's very, very murky.
Yeah, if she misled Parliament, she'd have to resign.
Well, it's generally understood a minister who misleads Parliament should offer their resignation. Yeah. Okay,
definitely. Okay, Sheila.
Nick, can we try and answer your question?
Yeah, go on.
The crucial question was, what's the future bring? Well, obviously we're focusing on Scotland. I mean, I think Ireland is absolutely crucial. We really have to see it the way the Irish situation goes, because it looks to me that the situation with regard to Northern Ireland is pretty untenable. But I think more broadly, so much of it, I think, depends upon two things. Whether the British government can make a success of Brexit. If they can make a success of Brexit, and if they can take, therefore, the wind out of the sails of the Scottish nationalists about Brexit, then that will make an enormous difference. And the second thing, which is far more important than anything we've been discussing this evening, is the impact of the COVID pandemic. This is potentially catastrophic for the British population, the British state, etc. And again, I think the capacity, which looks deeply challenged, of the British state to respond to that problem, I think will also be crucial. If the British government can demonstrate that Brexit has been a success, that is, it has dealt successfully with the COVID pandemic, then I think that will change everything. Because then I would think, at least, that people will look far more rationally at what the future brings. Because in a sense, this is an opportunity for the British state. I know that Nicola Sturgeon is playing the two off against each other, but if this is an opportunity for the British state to just demonstrate what it can do, if it fails, then it is catastrophic. Then I think then all bets are off. If it succeeds, then I think that makes a major shift. But we'll see. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think that's the crucial thing. If the British state makes a success of Brexit and can defeat the COVID pandemic, then the whole political position changes.
I want to put that point to David Torrance in just a second, but we've got a question from Sheila de Belay that relates to it, and it's really talking about the performance of you talked about the performance of the British state, and this is more about the performance of the Scottish government that's vis-a-vis Britain. So go ahead, Sheila.
Yeah, as I understand it, the SNP doesn't have a particularly good record in government, for instance, in education. And I suspect that a lot, as has been said, hangs on the reputation of Nicola Sturgeon herself. But given what's going on with the Alex Salmond affair, if the SNP kind of implodes, what happens then? And what happens with regard to the referendum?
David, I don't know how much you can. David has a job as a civil servant, so he can't make too many political statements. But to what extent can you talk about Nicola Sturgeon's reputation and the overall performance of how the Scottish government is seen vis-a-vis Westminster, perhaps?
Well, I'll retreat into academic surveys. So this is not my opinion, but there's been lots of academic and sort of quality journalistic assessments of the Scottish government's record and perceptions of Nicola Sturgeon. And yeah, there's the academics working in education, health and so on, all have criticisms of how the Scottish government has performed, as they do of the UK government. But they've also identified the fact that there's a mismatch between the empirical facts on the ground, you might say, and perceptions. And perceptions of Nicola Sturgeon's effectiveness as a political leader are indisputably very high. And so I suppose the point I would make is that I think Jeremy is implying a more direct link between performance and political reward than actually exists. For instance, the vaccine rollout thus far, and this is backed up by public opinion, seems to be going quite well. People are getting more positive about that. I think it would be too far to say that that will somehow translate into an increase in political support for either the Conservative Party or the Union in Scotland, because to some degree, I think it's clear that voters have already made up their minds. They've decided that they like Nicola Sturgeon as a leader, and they don't much like Boris Johnson as a leader. But of course, and this ties back to something both Murdo and Jeremy said, if there are personnel changes on both those fronts, that could have a significant impact. But I'm not convinced, judging on past form, surveys, opinion polls, and so on, that any of those changes or perceived failings or whatever would translate into a drastically changed prognosis for the main political parties or Union or independence.
Murdo, that's fair enough, isn't it? And the SNP is not just down to one politician or two politicians for that matter. And in terms of people's perception of Brexit, it doesn't look like it's going to change substantially, does it?
Yeah, the one thing I would slightly take issue with what David has said, and it goes back to something I mentioned earlier on, the rise in support for independence we've seen over the last year is almost entirely amongst women. And I think that is because of Nicola Sturgeon's leadership. And the point, Sheila, you made about the SNP's track record in government, I think is a very fair one. 12 months ago from now, Nicola Sturgeon had a popularity rating that was about 0. And it's gone up 50 points in the last 12 months on the back of handling the COVID pandemic. And that's been tied in with a rise in support for both the SNP and independents. So I think COVID's been a huge factor in this, and that ties in with what Jeremy was saying. And is the support from women for Nicola Sturgeon's leadership, does that outlast Nicola Sturgeon? If she's replaced by a dull middle-aged man like me, obviously I won't replace her, but someone of my ilk. Would women who were attracted to the SNP because of Nicola Sturgeon's leadership and handling the COVID pandemic still be as attracted to them? I'm not sure.
And similarly, one could almost also speculate if Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was to become leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. He has positive approval ratings in Scotland, largely on account of giving out lots of money over the past year. You might speculate, but yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I think Murdo's right. A lot of that third stage of the increase in support and independence has not only been quite strongly tied to Nicola Sturgeon, it's been strongly tied, according to one very authoritative survey, to the unpopularity of Boris Johnson. And therefore, innate in both of those things are that a change of personnel in London or Edinburgh could make a difference. I'm still not convinced it'd be a huge difference.
It took for the actual negotiations on Brexit to take place before we had any idea about what would happen to trade going across the border, and the implications are still being worked out and will drag on for a long time. I guess there are equally challenging questions when it comes to Scotland breaking away from the Union. And Helen Bessemer-Clark's got a question about one aspect of that. So Helen, go ahead and open your microphone and we'll take it from there. Helen? You just need to open your microphone, which is on the bottom.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Right. Hi, Nick. I just wonder if Scotland achieved independence, what would happen to all the Scots presently living in England and who seem to be so numerous in the media and in politics in England? Would they become foreign people? Would they have to have passports? What would be their position?
I'm going to add to that. We live slap bang on the Welsh border. We are the last village in England before Wales. I just have to walk out a few minutes from the door here and I cross the border. And a neighbour was saying, if the Scots break away, what happens to Wales? Will there be a border here? So there are numerous of uncertainties and questions you would hope that would be addressed before that there was a referendum. They certainly weren't addressed last time, I don't think. So I don't know, Murdo, do you want to take that? And perhaps I can't. I don't think Scots living in London are going to be asked for, to carry an ID card around with them. But what are these questions that have been asked?
Yeah, well, quite Michael Gove, Andrew Neil, Andrew Marr, all these
yes,
people
exactly.
will have an interest in this question. If I remember rightly, and David will probably correct me on this, but the 2014 white paper was very clear. People living whatever part of the UK they're living in would have the option. People in Scotland who had a British passport would basically retain the right to have that British passport for the rest of their lives. That's the way the SNP saw it, although these things, of course, would be a matter of negotiation between the government of an independent Scotland or part of the breakup negotiations. I suppose we do have a historic parallel, and that's what happened with Ireland, where there is still a common travel area between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, and that's a historical legacy, and there's no particular reason why that wouldn't continue in the event of the UK breaking up. I think, though, that the broader point does just show how complicated it is to try and dismantle a union that's existed in the context of Scotland for more than 300 years, in the context of Wales for much longer. And I say sometimes to nationalist friends who think it's great fun to tweet pictures of queues of lorries at the border trying to get across the channel, and Scottish seafood not being able to get through the ports to markets in Europe. I do say quietly to them, you do realize that if you think Brexit's a big problem with creating borders, breaking up the UK and creating internal borders would multiply this 100-fold, because the UK internal market is much, much more significant and integrated than the EU single market has ever been.
Yeah.
Jeremy, in this day and age, it's about identity, isn't it? I think back to the breakup of Yugoslavia and how disastrous and complex that was. We're not suggesting it's going to be the same here, but people vote for out of passionate belief, not because of economic reason, and Brexit's a proof of that.
But I think more and more of us, I mean, I've got to be careful how I say this, but nationalism is a throwback to the 19th century, really. It's, and you know well, Nick, that area of sort of Central Europe. And had you tried, I say to my students, I give them a map, the ethnic sort of diversity of Central and Eastern Europe, and say, now draw me a map of nationhood in that area. And you cannot do it. And if you do it, you're just asking for major problems. And surely nowadays we live with multiple identities. This is what I find really strange about this. That our age is one of multiple identities. And I was thinking, what is the previous question? Sorry?
You might feel that way, but recent history shows that people behave in the opposite way. They vote out of their...
A lot of people do, but it is rather strange. And I was thinking, I had an acquaintance of mine who was a Flemish nationalist, and she moved to Scotland and she voted in the previous referendum. And I said to her, great, you're destroying your own country, now you're going to destroy mine. And I was just sort of appalled by that, really. And I just think, I think we do have multiple identities, and this notion that one thing can define your identity, I find increasingly problematic. But you are right. It is, for many people, that is the thing.
Yeah.
But it is weird, I think, increasingly weird in a present day setting.
I want to go back. Let's take Annie McMahon, who's disguised as Simon with a beard. So go ahead, Annie.
Is it taken for granted? I think you've kind of hinted at this in some of the previous comments, but is it taken for granted that an independent Scotland would rejoin the EU? Because we were talking about this between ourselves the other day, and working that one out was well beyond me.
David, that's certainly the thrust of things, isn't it, from the SNP?
Yeah, this was much in contention in 2014 in the first referendum. The SNP had I think I can say this safely, an implausible position that an independent Scotland would automatically become a member of the EU, a sort of internal enlargement. It was all very, hardly anyone backed that up from a sort of professional point of view. Now, to be fair, Brexit has actually clarified the situation. The UK as a whole is out of the EU, so an independent Scotland would be an applicant. It would be a third country, as the UK now is. It would have to apply for membership. The Scottish government accepts that. Most European watchers and experts accept it would become a member. The only point of contention is how long it would take and subject to what conditions. And there are some question marks over entry accession criteria relating to debt, GDP ratios, all the rest of it. But no European expert I know of seriously thinks it would be rejected, vetoed, delayed for any length of time. There are questions, but the general consensus, it would be welcomed in. And indeed, several senior EU figures have said as much.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I want to take in two questions very quickly. So Diane Cook, very briefly, and also Chris Reed. So these are almost, sum up in 15 seconds. Go ahead, Diane Cook.
It's just a comment, perhaps for people outside the United Kingdom, that I'm not convinced, as Jeremy thinks, that we have multiple identities. I think if you ask people in Scotland about the English having multiple identities, they will see us as having an English identity, not a multiple identity.
Do stay on if you've got a moment now. What we do at this section now, we've gone through the main hour, the main discussion. If any of our panelists are happy to stay on, we're very happy for them to stay on. But if they want to disappear, they can. And this is where we just get everyone to sort of share their views. David, did we miss something out? It was a long discussion. I suppose we could talk about for a great length. But did you have any additional thoughts there?
I guess the only thing would be the mechanism by which Scotland becomes independent, although it's I mean, it can be a bit dry, but it is an important point. You know, it's not an easy process. Do you want me to briefly say that?
Tell us about that, yeah.
So interestingly, actually, Ireland has come up. Last week, Joanna Cherry, who's a Queen's Counsel and a senior SNP member of Parliament, suggested that the manner in which Ireland became independent almost a century ago was a model for Scotland. I couldn't really say this publicly, but I politely disagree privately. She had a slightly strange interpretation of history there. She said that in 1918, the 1918 general election, which took place after the First World War, Sinn Féin returned the vast majority of members in Ireland, and that from that followed treaty negotiations between Great Britain and representatives of Sinn Féin to agree what became Dominion status, sort of Canada-style status for most of Ireland. But that's not what happened, of course. The British ignored that general election result. Sinn Féin members didn't take their seats. They abstained from Westminster because they didn't recognise its authority. They set up their own parliament, the first Dáil in Dublin. The British declared that illegal in 1919. And the treaty negotiations flowed from a 2-year war of independence. So Joanna Cherry said that she didn't, of course, suggest that violence should form a part of this, but you can't actually separate the two. The only reason that most of Ireland became independent from the UK in 1920, 21, 22 was because there was a violent war of independence, and the British state, the mighty imperial British state, was basically pushed into compromising. So that to me is not the pattern. However, Joanna Cherry made the point that it shows you that legally and constitutionally part of the UK can secede. Ireland, all of Ireland was an integral part of the United Kingdom within the past century, and she is correct on that point. But now it would be by a referendum, a majority vote in that referendum. You would then have a negotiated process between the Scottish government and the UK government. In 2014, the SNP said that would take 18 months. I think most people accept that as a wildly optimistic timescale. Brexit demonstrates how long and difficult it took the UK to leave a union after only 45 years at a much shallower union in many respects. So 18 months would seem quite optimistic. But there'd be a negotiated process. You'd then have legislation passed at Westminster. That's been the form for every country which has left the British Empire, the British Commonwealth. There is always an enabling legislative act at Westminster. And as soon as that gets royal assent, Scotland's independent.
Wow. Could you envisage a scenario where Westminster puts off this referendum for 6 years, for a long period of time, and at which you might get another leader of the SNP who says, right, we're going to hold our own referendum like Catalonia? Murdo, do you think that's a possibility?
I think that's extremely unlikely, and the reason I think it's unlikely is because even if the Scottish government prepared to do that, almost certainly they would face legal challenges around unauthorised use of expenditure to run such a referendum, and almost certainly the pro-union parties in Scotland would boycott it. And what you'd end up with a situation, as they had in Catalonia, where, if I remember rightly, it was 90% voted for independence, but only 45% of the population turned out, and the whole thing became meaningless. Now, I don't think the UK government's going to end up doing what the Spanish government did, which is trying for treason various SNP politicians and sentencing them to 15 years in jail, much as I might like to relish that prospect. I don't think they're going to do that. I just don't think the SNP are going to go down that route. And I suppose the interesting question in the background here is, even with opinion polls showing support for independence, if they're in the kind of the mid-50s, if it's splitting 55-45, I don't think that indicates that this is an issue people are taking to the streets on. That might change. If it ended up being 75-25, which is where support for devolution was back in the 90s, that becomes a different issue, I think. But
they don't have to. You're saying that the standard that applies to Brexit does not apply to Scots independence?
No, I'm not saying that, but I don't think you would get people taking to the streets to demand independence while support for independence was in the 50s.
You're talking about in opinion polls?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
to back that up, I get what Murdo's saying. It's a question of salience. So in opinion polls, if you ask somebody a straight question, they will say yes or no. But how important they consider it can often be quite different. And the polling on independence is quite clear on 2 points, actually. First of all, that although there's a clear majority for independence, it is not a priority for most voters. Their priority is the pandemic. The priority is the economic consequences of that pandemic. And secondly, a majority of people don't want a referendum within the next 2 years. I think that's right. So the Scottish government position, interestingly, is they wanted a referendum last year. They want one this year, and when this year is over, they will want one next year. But that is not necessarily in line with where voters are.
Okay, Lewis Tart, you've got your hand raised. Go ahead, Lewis, and make your point.
Had a very interesting situation here in Australia because we have internal borders which have been shut. Because as you may know, Australia's got a series of internal states. And as part of COVID management, they have closed state borders. So we've actually started to see what happens when you close internal borders. We've had practical experience of it. So we've had a number of, some of them are quite easy because they're basically rivers and okay, some of them have actually got water in them at this point in time. But we've actually started to see the amount of travel that happens between borders. People got trapped, their holidays were basically stuffed, which is really upsetting for most Australians. But it's the practicalities of managing those borders. We've had quite a few lessons. So the best anecdote I've got is from the West Australians, because as you know, they're on the far side of the country and there's this very big desert in between, apart from the small road at the top, which is sort of currently being rained out at the moment. But what they found in Western Australia was, okay, the big trucks go across the Nullarbor. It's the most efficient way to transport goods around Australia. But what they found was they had to basically get the trucks back and forth. That was fine. They put basically a sort of checkpoint up there and they went through all the trucks. The drug busts have gone through the roof. The amount of drugs that are travelling internally in between the country, WA evidently is having a major drug shortage. There has been a phenomenal problem with that. Apart from occasionally somebody smuggling people through.
No parallels here. No parallels.
And that has been the most fascinating bit about it, is finding out that what actually goes over the borders. We've had other problems like, Nicholas, you'll know you're in a farming area. You'll find somebody who's a contractor, they'll have farm equipment and they'll quite happily go across borders doing different farms like headers and things like that. Yeah. You know, how do you suddenly find that if you're in Victoria, you've got to go to South Australia, they won't let you in, but there's farmers over there.
COVID's been very interesting. Our closest shops in Wales, and in theory, we're breaking the law if we go and buy a pint of milk. So it's
But Nicholas, that touches upon an interesting point, because in the past few months, there's been lots of grand talk about closing the Anglo-Welsh border, closing the Anglo-Scottish border. But the UK is not a federation like Australia. So that, as you say, Australia can close its borders because they are sovereign states. Scotland, Wales are not sovereign entities yet. So I think that Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, have quite enjoyed talking about closing the border, because it implies they have a lot more power than they actually have.
I mean, that's really what's come out of the COVID situation, is that it seems to imply that these are the first ministers in each state have got enormous amounts of powers, and perhaps
and that's, I mean, we could get into the dynamics of sort of quasi-autonomous states, but generally whoever leads those quasi-autonomous states likes to give the impression that they have more power than they actually do. But they can't close borders. All they can do is instruct the police to patrol the motorways linking England and Scotland a bit more heavily. But there are still trains going across, there's still traffic. I'm sure if you were on foot, you could get across Hadrian's Wall quite easily. It would be almost impossible to close internal borders in the UK. Northern Ireland is different, obviously. There's a large body of water between them and the mainland.
Yeah.
Can I, Nick, because I'm going to go actually now because I'm getting rather hungry, but can I just say one thing? I I voted Remain, but it seems to be quite clear now that Brexit is not going to be a disaster. I see no reason to believe it will. And as much as I would regret Scottish independence, I see no reason to think that would be a disaster either. I'd rather hope that the powers of human ingenuity on both sides would be able to say, okay, this is what people have decided, and let us now sit down and produce the best outcome for all concerned. And I see no reason to think that would not be possible.
How you define a disaster?
Sorry?
I guess that depends on how you define a disaster.
Well, yeah, well, no, it would be emotionally upsetting, I'm sure. But I mean, I'm trying to say that, I don't think that. I think, so far, I have every reason to believe that Brexit will work moderately well, and as much as I would think
possible and manageable. That's basically, it's possible and manageable.
Well, it could be better than that. I mean, it's up to human ingenuity. Human beings are remarkable people. They can, they're faced with a problem, they can find solutions, and I regret Brexit, but there we are.
Yeah.
We're saving the British fishing industry every day, and so on.
The fishermen take that view right at the moment.
I am joking, of course. I'm joking, but
Jeremy, I think the parallel with Scottish independence I think is interesting, because I think you're probably right about we'll get over Brexit, but there's still quite a chunk of the population who emotionally are going to take a long time to get over Brexit.
Of course.
Because they feel European. Most of these people are university professors, by the way, who feel European. They grew up with the Erasmus program and are deeply hurt that it's all disappearing.
Although
quite a small section of society. Now,
Murdo, on that point, I love Erasmus coming up in the Scottish context, but I thought that Nicola Sturgeon's statement the other week about the loss of Erasmus being this earth-shattering blow to Scotland, but she then gave the statistic: 2,000 Scots take advantage of Erasmus every year. 2,000. That's nothing in the grand scheme of things.
The point I was going to make was if the emotional pool of Europe for a section of the population was X, the emotional pool of Britain for a section of the Scottish population is X times 100. So the emotional pain that Scottish independence would cause would blow Brexit out of the water. Absolutely. And I think this is often underestimated by people looking at the independence debate in Scotland. There's a big, probably 40% of the Scottish population who feel pretty strongly British or Scottish and British, for whom
I think one thing we haven't spoken about is that to break up the union, there are Britain's role in the world, you could argue, has been undermined by Brexit already. Our influence has been damaged, our reputation has been damaged. If the United Kingdom breaks up, where does that leave the Security Council, for example? Where does it leave, we often talked about, our nuclear deterrent. There are a whole range of things that suddenly go that aren't contemplated, I don't think. And I think we will begin to talk about them more and more as this debate evolves.
Well, the loss of place in the Security Council might be an accurate reflection of where we are. And we're only there for historic reasons.
True. But if you're somebody, and the Chatham House has just produced a paper about creating a global Britain, the Security Council is very much part of that. So if you look at Whitehall thinking and foreign policy thinking, that is instrumental.
I don't think that would change. I remember this coming up in 2014 because that's a Pandora's box a lot of people don't want to open up, membership of the Security Council. And I think by virtue of that fear of what might flow from that, not just on the part of the UK, but other large countries, I think that would be left well alone, rightly or wrongly, but I think it would continue.
Let's bring in a couple of comments and then we're going to wrap it up there. So we've got Sheila de Blague has got her hand raised, and also Nigel Harley. Let's go with Sheila first, then Nigel. Go ahead, Sheila.
No, mine's just a flippant comment. My daughter and son-in-law live in Edinburgh, and it's his birthday today. And so they had lobster for supper. And I just thought to myself, well, there's 2 lobsters that are not rotting in a lorry waiting to get across France.
I hope they got them cheap.
I hope they did.
Nigel Harley, go ahead. More lobsters, please, Nigel. You have to unplug your mic, open your microphone up, bottom left-hand side. Nigel, are you there? No, I think we give up on Nigel, and I think at that point we wrap it up. Thank you very much again to Murdo Fraser, Jeremy Jennings, and David Torrance. It's been a really, really interesting discussion, and I think we'll be returning to it in the not too distant future. Thank you very much again. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thanks. Thanks.